What? Am I finished with the Bren gun?
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of busy right now.
Yeah.
Well, bombing of the Great War. By these, 1915 or so?
Wow. Wah, wah.
Well,
Wah, 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 wah.
I'm kind of busy.
Wah, wah. Wah, 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 wah. Wah.
Okay, look, I appreciate you want to see more Bren. Okay, good. Tell you what, I'll phone my pal Rich, yeah? He's got a lot to say about the Bren, and we'll work something out. Okay, will that work for you?
Yeah, yeah. Wah, 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 wah. Wah, 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 wah. Wah, 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 wah.
Well, it better. Because, as you can see, yeah, I am busy.
Wah, wah,
With what?
wah.
The Hun! They're really close, okay? So just, how about, leave me alone and let me get to work, okay? Just bugger off.
Wah,
Yeah, beat it. Go watch the video, okay?
wah, wah.
What are you waiting for? Get out of here. So I'd like to welcome to the channel Rich Fischer of the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association, who actually was, well, I was very fortunate enough to come by Rich's acquaintance through my explorations of different weapons and particularly different historical texts and manuals that Rich is, well, for the benefit of all of us, graciously hosted on his website. And that's developed into a bit of a friendship. I actually visited with Rich in, 20,
22.
2018. And
No,
as far as the Bren gun goes, Rich gave me my very first opportunity to fire it. So I have a special place in my heart for Rich Fischer of the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association. Welcome, Rich.
thanks, Rob. It was 2022 because
22. Got it.
yes, it
18,
was.
22. It's how
As
time
we
stands still or flies, depends on which way you look at
said,
it.
it was just before my wedding, so I ought to know. Um, but yeah, so it's not actually too many years ago you came across, but we did have the opportunity to go on the range that day and fire a few different things, which was super. And I think as a bit of introduction to the association for people that don't know, we're now a charity that operates in the UK, and our charitable object, to call it what its grand title is, to advance the education of the public in military history and firearms, relating to but not exclusively the Vickers machine gun. So that does include quite a lot. If you want to draw that spider diagram of things you can relate to the Vickers machine gun, it certainly includes the Bren, which let's say we had out on the range that day, and almost everything else if you really want to. And we're certainly having the opportunity at the moment with some of the work we're doing to explore more of those firearms as well.
It sounds like a wonderful way to frame the association as far as its mandate goes, and allows you the flexibility to deal with, as you say, a lot of things other than just the Vickers. That's obviously the association's sort of bread and butter. Would I be remiss or not remiss, but out of line to say that would be your sort of primary sort of passion and the interest that brought you into this whole thing?
Yeah, so my grandfather was a Vickers machine gunner. It's as simple as that, really. And there's often a relationship that leads these things. So he was a Vickers machine gunner in the Second World War, only for a few years. In 42, I think he ends up in the regular army, and then leaves in early 46. So he was just a wartime soldier, happened to be put into the Cheshire Regiment. We're in Wiltshire, but he ended up in the Cheshire Regiment for a period, which meant he was a machine gunner, and then only spent 12 months, I'd say, with the Vickers. So he did 6 months training and then 6 months in service with the Cheshire Regiment over in Italy, and then ended up as an infantier with the King's Shropshire Light Infantry. So his time with the Vickers was limited, but it had enough of an influence on him that then when we went to museums and things when I was 10, 11, 12, he would always sort of move towards the Vickers. And on one occasion, he sat down behind the Vickers and took it apart in the middle of the museum. So he could put it back together again, thankfully, as well. So he had that influence at that early age, and it will be 30 years in January 2026. So when I bought my first Vickers machine gun, albeit deactivated at the age of 12, 13 at that point. And we now have, I think it's 42. I'm going to say 43. These numbers blur after a while, but 43 of them in the room, many of which are up behind me here, and it is that central piece. So my passionate interest is about the Vickers, but in doing so, and in digitizing all that material for the past 20 years and putting the website together, we've become experts by accident, is a phrase that comes to mind in many other things, because there isn't anybody else that puts Bren gun material online, the manuals and things, Lewis gun, all the British small arms, all the American stuff now as well. So 20 plus years ago, when PDF technology and stuff started to exist, I decided that I didn't want to get manuals out being oily, and some of the stuff is expensive and valuable. So I started to digitize it all. And like you say, you've used that. And it was some of those resources that started some of the conversations between us a fair few years ago now.
Well, it was by chance I came across it, just, searching for stuff online, and all of a sudden your website appears, many years ago when I found it. And, are you kidding? All of this stuff is there? Wait a minute, hold on a second.
Yeah.
And then as the sort of projects for British muzzleloaders began to evolve, it became a real go-to, especially for anything related to the 20th century. And it's been such an integral part of developing what happens on British muzzleloaders that I just feel indebted, because although these things are available in terms of antique bookstores and that kind of stuff, the fact that so many of them, and you continue to do so and put them online, but so many of them were there at your fingertips for instant reference. It was just an absolute, you couldn't have wished for sort of a more happy circumstance in moving into projects that I was looking and very interested in approaching. So, one of which, of course, which has brought us together today, is the channel's exploration of the Bren gun. And this series in particular has been a huge conglomeration of effort from many different people to make this happen. And I've been very fortunate enough to be able to have made relationships and partook in generous offers to make it happen. And you've been part of that, not only in my initial shooting of the Bren, but also, of course, in that documentation piece. But because of the nature of the association and its sphere of approach that's greater than just the Vickers, and including the Bren, as you've mentioned, I thought perhaps today would be a great opportunity to sort of tap into a little bit of that and bring your experience and the association's experience with the Bren, and have this kind of conversation to sort of round out the channel's Bren series, which has been fairly comprehensive as far as my approach goes. Anyway, I consider it to be that way. And living where I live, access to this stuff is not easy, as it is perhaps where you live, without the overarching organization of the association. So I was just wondering if you would expand perhaps on your personal experience with the Bren, and how does it fit into the association in terms of its the attention paid to it, etc.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the Bren was one of the first non-Vickers firearms that we took on as an association in its firing capacity as well. So it's a parallel story to the Vickers, in many cases, and we'll probably touch on that a bit more. But the early period of when we had firing machine guns, and that's a complex subject in itself about how we do that. But we've had Bren guns as soon as we possibly could. And partly because if you want to understand machine gunnery of any sort, a light machine gun and a medium machine gun help you do that. I've shot a lot of Vickers now, and I've shot a fair amount of Bren guns alongside it. And more recently, I don't do the shooting; I just do the driving around. Which is somebody made the comment that if I was a gun tuber, I'm more the Uber bit at the moment because I end up just transporting these things to other people to have a shoot off. And but I think the Bren is one of those secret admirations and guilty pleasures because it's we are the Vickers MG collection, but at the end of the day, if we're going to get the Brens out on a range, it's a good day. We know they're going to work. We know they're going to work in most occasions. There have been times when the 762 bits have ended up in a 303 bit and things haven't quite gone to plan. But that is the problem of having too many Brens. And people say, how can you have too many Brens? But we currently have about 25 of them, ranging from early Mark 1s through to Indian-made 1969 examples in 762. And we've got Al4s and even some of the Italian breeder 3006 examples at the moment as well are loaned into us. So we've got quite a breadth of Bren understanding. And say I can't remember when we shot. Did we put them on a tripod as well, Rob?
We did. Both light
did.
roll and on the tripod. Yeah,
we did. That's right. Yeah, and if I remember rightly, you could shoot better with it. Well, a lot of people can shoot better with it on the bipod than they can on the tripod. But I think it was an embarrassingly accurate group for you for a first-time shooter.
It must have been It must have been a wonderful example of the weapon.
Too accurate. We'll talk about too accurate. But it was. It is one of those things that they're going to work. We've tinkered with them. We've worked through all the different examples, and I think you can understand why the British Army went for it in the way it did, and you can understand how it's become totemic, and it's ubiquitous. Are words that we use for the Vickers from that early part of the century, but that latter part, the British Army is the Bren gun at that point, and so. It is a guilty pleasure for me when we get the Brens out. We probably don't do it often enough, but we certainly make sure we do. And they're a firearm as well that is a really flexible firearm. The first time we shot the Brens, I think it might have been just after, but was for the shoot that we did with Matt Moss of the Armourer's Bench when we were doing the Sniper Bren myth.
Yes.
The Siege of Jadotville.
Yeah.
And using the Bren was incredibly accurate. You can use it as a single shot. You don't thumb load around with a mag off and stuff like that nonsense. And if you've got a 4T, you'll use it. But the Bren can be, it is great at single shot fire, yet we've also had it sat on the tripod, belting out magazines at 120 to 125 rounds a minute for a few minutes. And you can certainly see the heat coming off the barrel at that point. So having a single firearm that can do all those things and still do those things, there are quite a few examples of firearms in our collection that we wouldn't have that versatility with, even though you might have done originally. They're great firearms to have, and they're great firearms to shoot. We have a slight problem in the collection, and we've got an event coming up very shortly where we'd like members of the public to handle the Bren as part of it, but we're overwhelmed by live examples and barely any deactivated examples. So we have to sort of think about how do we get the deacs in, because at some point all these Brens come into play in the story we have to tell.
Right. So it obviously has a really important place within the collection. Now, based on that, have you done any an expanded sort of the literary or the academic work on the Bren gun? Much, I guess, paying the same attention or similar amount of attention to it as you may have done with the Vickers?
Yeah, and I think it's everybody has an opinion on the Bren, which is great. Because Yeah, we really struggle as a YouTube channel. We're very niche-ish. We've started to try and use the hashtag not just VickersMG to try and get out there that we're not just VickersMG, but we are very niche. And people don't argue with us enough on the Vickers. People don't ask, they ask a few questions, but it's sort of, we've done loads of work on it, and we're some of the only people that have done that work on it. And when we've done that work, we've done it with people like Dole Goldsmith when he was alive, and we've got books published out there that have become sort of tomes and reference guides for them. Some of that stuff does exist for the Bren, and we've ripped some of that apart and understood it and trying to get back around it. And in doing so my day job is not for the association, despite what my family, friends, and everybody think. My day job is for a university, and I'm a research fellow that has been able to take some of the material that I've got here and take that into the day job. So I have done research into the Bren and academic level research, academic papers and stuff that thankfully are available online as well for free. They're not stuck behind academic paywalls. And one of those was taking an academic, or I'm going to say semi-objective, because it is approach to the Bren and comparison. So the Bren versus the MG42 is one of those great comparisons of time. Everybody has a view on that, whether you're I'm not going to say pro-German, but you're pro-42 and what it did with its rate of fire. Or you're pro-Bren in the accuracy, the slow rate of fire, the magazine feed. Everybody's got their side of the fence. Some people like petrol cars, some people like diesel cars, some people like electric. It is that MG42 or Bren. It's like you're not allowed to like both. And one of the pieces that I did was, how do we take such different pieces of technology and compare them in a like-for-like manner? And at the end of the day, the Bren and the German machine gun, be that the 34 or the 42, do the same job. They provide the automatic firepower within the infantry section. And actually, when you start to look at them like that, they really become very similar. Certainly at the start of the Second World War, for the British tactics change a little bit and the organization changes. But if you look at where the war started with the 34 and the Bren in the infantry section, they're both the central point in the section. They both have about 1,000 rounds, and for both of them, all the riflemen are there to do is support that machine gun. So they're the gun group concept that becomes the British Army's point of difference in 44, 45, or post 42, really. And you said you'd seen all the manuals. There's a massive step change in 1942 with the Small Arms Training Manual series. And actually, that's just really reflective of how the British, that is the turning point in the war. And we can examine that through just looking at the Small Arms Training Manuals and how they're all reissued and changed. But it actually, something really small, technological equipment based, gives us an opportunity to look at strategic level changes in doctrine and logistics and everything that's around it. So applying some modern defense management techniques, models, frameworks for capability management. So the Bren and the German machine guns, and I wrap the 34 and 42 together in that, they provide the capability. And it's when you can start to examine that capability that you can start to compare them like for like. And the sort of next step academic level of stuff that we looked at and was something called the defense lines of development. And I looked at how that's defense lines of development is a British Ministry of Defence procurement framework or acquisition framework, capability management framework. And it takes the training, the equipment, the personnel, the information, the doctrine, the organization, the infrastructure, and the logistics as the 8 silos as such that need to work together for a capability to be considered ready for service. And
so if I can just clarify, then you
yeah.
essentially took a modern approach to assessment of a given item or a given capability, and you are applying that to the Bren and the MG42,
Yeah.
and is a way to compare them. Is that
Yeah.
Am I
That's right.
understanding you
Yeah,
correct? Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So I did that for the Vickers in isolation. I just used it as a way of telling the Vickers story and how things changed for the Vickers, first of all, but then took that and went, actually, let's add some numbers in, let's score some things and see if we can compare these, like for like. And yeah, there's lots of argument as to whether it's effective or not, but it gives me an opportunity to at least try it. And I did. And there's not huge amounts of difference in them, and the there are some significant points of difference, but they're not necessarily the ones that people normally think about. People normally think about ammunition consumption and that being a problem, that the MG42 will eat through that ammunition, but they do so in sort of neglecting how you train a soldier. You train a soldier to do some good ammunition management and burst control and stuff like that. And once you start to bring in training, it's not just the matter of the equipment. The equipment can have these technological points of difference, and your training is supported by logistics, which then helps support the doctrine, and it all turns into a sort of hierarchy that's better graphical than me explaining it with my hands, but it does turn into a better understanding. Like I say, that paper is available for anybody to read. It was published by the Royal United Services Institute, so RUSI. And that's available on their journal website for people that want to understand the nitty gritty about that. But simply, the sort of standout points for me were training. And the German army spent a lot of time focused on their sustained fire role training, or not sustained fire, the heavy role, the Schwer, role for the MG42 for every soldier, whereas the British Army, and the Canadians, and anybody that was following those small arms training manuals spent less time on tripods, because that's not how they're going to be used in most cases, particularly as the war progressed. And the indirect fire role or the fixed line role that develops with the Bren is sort of like, it's like the Vickers in concept, but it's not there to do the same job as the Vickers. So you can't, why train every soldier on it if they're barely going to use it? And certainly when they start to withdraw those fixed line sights and tripods and start to just use them in anti-aircraft role, or realize we can do fixed line firing without clever sights, we just need to have somebody walk out there, put a stick in the ground. You start to see those changes, and the British Army flexes their training to focus more on the job that the Bren is going to do and more on the skills for every soldier in doing that than the Germans do. And that's the point of difference that becomes actually tangible in that research. So yeah, it's there for everybody to go and argue. Again, this is one of those things that I like to put the information out there, and then we get reviewed from an academic perspective from other academics and other professionals in doing that. But it's out there now that if people disagree on something, then great. That's what makes conversation work.
So is this something that perhaps we can explore in a Cole's Notes version? If I were to sit here and pound the table and say MG42 all the way, and everything else is completely deficient, and is that something that then you could perhaps educate me as to how the Bren is not, uh, you know, to be pushed to underneath that pile, and convince me perhaps that the Bren is something that I shouldn't be completely eschewing, and focusing on my MG42, and that it's the only machine gun that's worth its weight and worth paying any attention to.
Yeah, I mean the British did this in sort of the late 40s. The exact date's a little bit unclear, but there was an operational research group that looked at Bren versus MG42 as a concept. They looked at comparisons, and in the end, they sort of went, "Oh, well, we're not just doing that direct comparison. We're looking at a magazine-fed, machine gun versus a bout-fed machine gun with a high rate of fire." And it still happens today in modern defense discussion. Do we want that really high rate of fire thing like the mini me, or do we want that really better accurate thing like the LSW in the British concept, or we actually need to go somewhere between the two, and that's what they decided in 46 as well, and that started feeding into GPMG development. So it depends on the context, for the argument. Are we talking Tunisia 1942, or are we talking Far East 1945? Are we talking Normandy 44? What exactly is all of that? Who's using it? As the war progresses, the machine gunners in the German army get slacker. And one of the things that we've identified through some of the resources was, and through our own use as well, is that they're bout-fed machine guns, but that means you've got to pay attention to the bout. German machine gun bouts are finicky and fiddly and need cleaning every time you reload them, and they, if any slight dents, they cause a problem, and they either in a can, in a drum, which I've got somewhere here, or around your neck. And if you carry them around your neck, they're just getting filthy. So there's loads of problems that come into the bout-fed concept that are a logistics problem. They become a training problem. They become a personnel problem. Magazine-fed weapons work potentially better for conscript armies that just have to go, okay, well, I've got to load the magazine correctly. But once that's done, it's a pretty robust weapon. And I think that's something we've found with firing the Brens as well, as I sort of said, that we know we haven't got to really worry when we take them out to fire them.
That's an interesting point you mentioned about the I guess inherent perhaps weaknesses of a belt-fed weapon. And as you were talking there, my thoughts pivoted slightly to the Far East, and perhaps in some of the circumstances that the British and Empire forces found themselves in terms of being in a jungle, a very close country, vegetation-wise, especially. That is something that I hadn't thought of, is the fact that, to be a Bren gunner carrying a Bren gun through the bush and maneuvering through that and bringing it to bear where it needed to be, with a couple of pouches full of magazines and a couple of guys behind you with more, to turn that around and replace it with a weapon that's got to have, especially in the context of, close quarters engagements, well, you're going to have it loaded, you'd expect.
Yeah.
And then navigating through bush with a belt hanging off, and bringing more of that to bear as an action developed in what could be very close circumstances. It just all of a sudden, as you mentioned, that really put a light bulb in my head to say, well, you're right, that in those contexts, a magazine-fed weapon is definitely handier, easier to bring to bear, and easier to sustain at the moment than perhaps a belt-fed weapon. And that is something that should be taken into consideration in the broader, comparison between the two. It's not just a nice green field in France or.
No, absolutely. And one of the things of, well, don't you have a different weapon for that? Well, that means if you have a different weapon for that, you can't move a different battalion because they're not trained on that different firearm. Then and then you need two different sets of training for it. So you can't. You need a standard system. Otherwise, you're going to fall apart in a way, and or certainly not going to operate as efficiently at some level or other. And I think if you look at the small arms training manuals, and any of the viewers do, go and have a look at the India version for the Bren. So light machine gun pamphlet number 4, really interesting pamphlet from a perspective. Nobody ever said that before, did they? Really interesting pamphlet.
This guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're both on this call, and maybe there's one or two others who we could name.
The
but
world
they,
is blue.
so they but that's the pamphlet that has the Far East soldier firing the Bren from the hip in a really great cartoon style diagram, and slung, and you can see actually it's a close quarter weapon. It's great. And I think one of the conclusions I drew from the academic work was that, because people always ask, well, what would you choose? And it's like, well, if I'm attacking, I'm going to choose a Bren because there's better close quarter battle, better maneuverability. If I'm defending, I might well choose the MG42. And it depends on the context. It always depends on the context, because you've got the drum mags that fit on the side of the 42, but then you've got to carry them separately, and they don't fit in anything other than their special carry-on. So, and yeah, there's pluses and minuses, pros and cons, but I think the Bren is a fascinating firearm that did, say it was everywhere. And can you imagine being in the 30s, so the late 30s, getting issued the Bren when you'd had a Lewis? There's lots of tales of, oh, well, I always preferred the old one. SLR SA80 is a great example. SLR was, God's own firearm or whatever. And the SA80 was horrible. The SA80 is horrible for some reasons. Some of those not justified, some justified, whatever. I'm not going to do that one. But can you imagine being given the Bren and thinking, oh, I much preferred the Lewis? No, I've never seen it. So it's one of those research rabbit holes you'd have to send somebody on for a very long time, I think, before they found a soldier that preferred the Lewis.
I prefer this gun that comes apart in 87,000 pieces, and this one that comes apart in four.
Yeah, where's my mallet? Because I need to take the barrel out of the Lewis. Or do I just go click? Oh, look, my barrel's come off. Yay! Yeah. It's new. They're so different. They're so different. And the other reason that pamphlet number 4, light machine gun, India, in 1942 is great because it actually is the last one that the Vickers Berthier appears in as well, which is a completely separate topic, but is one of the reasons, one of my many justifications for having Brens is because Vickers Berthiers exist. And when you put the two together, you can understand that they are very, very similar firearms in their concept, design, application, use, whatever. And really it's a politics issue, or certainly my understanding and my research says it's a politics issue, is why we don't end up with the Vickers Berthier, but we do end up with the Bren, and nobody should sort of be concerned with the trajectory we went on with that.
Right. So it's fair to separate the general purpose nature of the 3442 when we're comparing it to the Bren, because the Bren doesn't really have a similar, sustained fire capability, much like the 42 and the 34 did when they're on their tripod. But when you leave it at the light roll for both really, what was some of perhaps if you are able to comment on some of the salient characteristics of either that really cut through some of the um, nostalgic, retrograde looks and personal feelings that people have in relation to these two things.
So I think the main thing is rounds on target when they matter. So if you consider that Bren is going to put its rounds on target, the first or second shot, and it's going to hit what you're aiming at. So suppression happens that way. The German machine gun concept was different. A high rate of fire meant that you could have a slightly lower trained individual potentially, and a slightly less accurate weapon, or a less accurate weapon, getting 25 rounds on target before you lose aim. Yeah, so that's, and it's just how you deal with both of those issues. If you've got a 50 round bout on the side of your MG42 in a little drum, or you've got 50 round bouts from the cans or whatever, you've got 2 bursts in that. Even if you're doing automatic fire, which is not the immediate doctrine, it's single shots, repetition, make it sound like a rifle, hide where the light machine gunner is. And if you start to put those, you've got 5-6 bursts in the magazine of accurate fire. So suppression, and this is something that I still need to explore from and we'll try it, and we might as well. It gives us,
we're going to try it. Who's the one going to be hiding in the trench when you're shooting?
Yeah, somebody has to do something really quickly. But suppression has to be something that you can compare. And my take on it at the moment is that actually with the training that they had, so I'm not just going to say good shots, because they were trained from a 0 to good shot. With the training they had, the British Bren gunners would suppress in a greater way than the German machine gunners would, for a longer period of time. And that's key in a firefight that is designed around a 10-minute battle, because your thousand, you still only got 1,000 rounds. It's still going to last as long as well, because although those rounds get on target quite quickly, when you look at the practical rates of fire rather than the cyclic, and I'm just looking at some of my notes here, the Bren's practical rate of fire per minute was 1/112. Four magazines of 28 rounds. You wouldn't do any more than that. We've done more than that, and it gets hot. But the per minute rate for the practical rate of fire for the MG42 is 150 to 180. And don't get me wrong, 100. There's a difference there. It's about a third difference, or a quarter to a third difference, more with the 42. But if they're not on target, it doesn't matter. So if you've got the accuracy built into the Bren stays on target, and you've shot it, you know how well it stays on target. The 42 and to some extent the 34 don't. And they're not necessarily designed to. They are incredibly difficult to fire from the shoulder and maintain on target. There are lots of people out there that still use them in a military sense, and you will be able to do that. But I'd be interested to know what and again, this is sort of more research from my perspective, what the soldier of 1943, 44 was able to do with that and keep them on target as well. Because the flip side, though, is the morale effect. And I think we've probably all seen or all aware of the US Army's videos of the rates of fire and being fired, so that they understood the morale effect of that. And there is certainly a characteristic that in my scoring of all these, I attributed to the personnel column, because people aware morale has an impact. The 42 has an adverse morale effect on the enemy that you have to teach out of the enemy, being the British, the Canadians, the Americans at that point. So, the fact that those rounds don't end up on target doesn't matter. People are still keeping their heads down. And so suppression works without hitting, only for so long, in that people suddenly realize, it's a 42. I don't, by September, if you've been sure you hear a 42 fire, are you going to duck? Probably not, because is it near you? Is it having an effect on you? The similarities in the Bren and the 42 are much, much closer than people realize. And there's a lot of very similar tactics and effects of the development of the 20s and 30s. The British and the Germans and exist within the same sphere at some point. They're still planning to fight each other at some point. So the sort of the arms race or the military races are still, they're in parallel. So the developments are happening in the same way. Neither has a particular advantage. Yeah, and I think the fact as well, you can single shot a Bren. You can single shot a Bren when it's on automatic. It's a slow enough rate of fire, you can do that. But you can stick it to repetition. And so if you need to slow down your ammunition consumption but maintain a point of aim, you can. And I think that's what I said earlier about the sort of the universal role of the Bren as a heavy rifle through to a sustained fire. It's designed as neither, but it's capable of both. Right. When I was writing the work, I had this, what is the context, and my view was, advancing out of Normandy, 21st Army Group advancing out of Normandy against German machine guns, not the beaches. We're beyond the beaches. 42s weren't necessarily there. We're fighting infantry divisions to infantry divisions. So that was the context for this. And when you're in that, like you say, the how they're fighting at that point is very, very similar. And it comes to how the trained soldiers are using their firearms, how those firearms are being organized and supplied, and and then that bigger piece of infrastructure and logistics, which is the back end of that as well. And one of the points of the Bren that is a point of difference. We were making Brens in Enfield. We were making Brens across the UK with the Monotype Corporation, and and you were making them there in Canada as well, and so were the Australians, and the Germans don't have that depth of resource. They don't have that. So if they want to provide 42s to other countries alongside the Axis powers, they can't. If the Canadians can use their own Canadian-made Brens, the Far East can have the Brens made out of Lithgow. So actually, some of the infrastructure around how the Brens are produced is actually a massive factor in moving this forward as well. And the fact that the Germans continued to make 34s right up to the end of the war as well, detrimentally to the production of the 42. And it would be remiss of me to say that one of the firearms that we've yet to really examine and explore, featured in one of our dispatches from the dugout episodes on the table, is the MG42V, which was a expedited production firearm, very, very simple manufacturing of the bolt and the barrel to speed up that production towards the end of the war. So it's a prototype example that we have here, and I've only sort of 10 or so made, but that fired at 2,000 rounds a minute, because in speeding things up, they took out some of the springs in the buffer mechanism in the rollers and stuff, and weakened that. So it's one that we're going to have to be very bold when we take the opportunity to fire that. But I'm sure we will at some point.
That's just you made 2,000 rounds a minute from the shoulder in the light roll.
Yeah.
It's that if there was ever a bucking bronco, I think that's probably it. Eh?
And part of my notes on how that's considered as a counter to the doctrine is why would you even consider that? Is because you've got en masse Russian hordes. So actually you're just creating a faster firing weapon because there's a target that's en masse. So there's no point putting that in the Western, against the British and Japs, because there's no targets for 2,000 rounds a minute. But actually, if you think about in what it was being designed for, so this is late 44, early 45, then that's in their minds potentially as the doctrine that they're trying to counter with that technological development. But really, that is about speeding up production. But the Germans didn't just stop with the 42 is what that leads us to, and the 34 to the 42 development is akin to perhaps the Bren Mark 1 and the Mark 2 simplification, in how that went. And that's certainly how I started to talk about it. But they went a step further. It didn't work. We went a step further with the Mark 3. Didn't happen within wartime. But of course, we've got the Mark 1M variants and everything in terms of it for the Bren that are that transition to the Mark 2 as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Bren is quite fascinating for us as the Vickers MG collection, is because the Vickers MG goes into service as the Mark 1 and comes out of service 56 years later as the Mark 1. Everything on that 1945 last year of production gun in Australia will fit on that 1914 production gun from Erith. The Bren development series is fascinating because iterations were much quicker and not necessarily compatible. So from a collector's study perspective, isn't that a fascinating contrast to this other machine gun that was in use at the same time as well? But I digress because I started talking about the Vickers.
What would you say, perhaps as we have been going through this discussion, is, and we may have already touched on it to a degree, is perhaps in your mind anyway, what would be one of the biggest misconceptions about the Bren that may exist out there?
I think it's that too accurate moniker that is just what? As compared to what did you want from it? What do you want from it? Too accurate for so I did a bit of research into this years ago now, and it needs finishing, it needs reworking, it needs doing something decent with, but and maybe combining with some of that sniper Jadet film nonsense, but it's all right. It's just different. It means you can put rounds on target straight away, and it is that. I've been writing up the Bren recently, and I think I've mentioned that to you previously. But The training is that you can do 30 aimed shots a minute, aim shots on repetition, on single shot. That's like first. And then after you've suppressed the enemy with single shots, or if that isn't working, or you need to fire at a rapid rate, then you switch to automatic. So in a way, you've got the Browning automatic rifle, the Lewis introduced as an automatic rifle, but the Bren is the one that's introduced as a light machine gun, but really was an automatic rifle. So the too accurate thing is just about get the rounds on target straight away, and it feels like too accurate is the counter to the high rate of fire that is the 42, that makes the 42 so good, and the Bren is so bad because it's too accurate. The only, I think the only account where I've read that somebody preferred the Lewis is Quartered Safe Out Here, if I remember rightly, and I might be wrong on that because it's sort of a few years since I've looked at it, when it was that anti-ambush, that immediate reaction to contact. Like, we want a firearm that will spray the jungle. And how do you spray the jungle with a with a really accurate gun? You just move it about a bit. It's one of those that's that doesn't make sense, and that's the only time I've found a sort of contemporary perception of it, or use of the too accurate
I think that
examples.
there's an element to that discussion that it's two different ways of looking at uh, well, machine gun fire. And if you put in the concept or put it in the case of shooting at a target at 300 yards and you're looking to hit some sort of shape. Now that could easily translate into shooting at the slit of a bunker or at the periscope of a tank, and any number of physical point targets. There's obviously merit in the more accurate you can place those rounds at that one point, which is in the broad spectrum, a very small area, that it's going to be more effective than if nothing either goes through or into that object, or in the immediate area around it. But the other piece to that is, the actual power of machine gun fire, in that it forms its beaten zone and its dangerous space and its dangerous zone. And it's not, bullets at a target, it's bullets across admittedly a very narrow but very long area that then, will deny the opportunities or the capability of crossing that area. And that's perhaps a nuance, especially perhaps in a more, well, let me say, more modern world that is all about the spectacle of automatic fire, whether it's in a video or not, is the way automatic fire is used on the battlefield in differing circumstances and for different reasons. That, in that close context and trying to assault a specific thing, a bunker perhaps, or a house, and making sure all those rounds are going through the window or into the slit or, through the door from 200 yards away as you shoot yourself in, uh, to that one spot, or even closer for that matter, then that accuracy is something that you would want. You want those rounds to be in a specific spot. And if you're firing 100 rounds at it and only, or none of them, that the area that those rounds are spread, the cone of fire, as it were, was so large that those rounds are, for one reason or the other, being distributed in a wider spot. It may look impressive as rounds are kicking out dirt left, right, and center, but the actual effect on your target would be greater if those rounds were more closely grouped and more concentrated on that one specific point. That stands in a little bit of separation from the concept of the beaten zone. I use that euphemistically to incorporate the three parts that are
Yeah.
combined in the dangerous zone, as it was alluded to in the training material. Um, that you really don't understand what that looks like or what the effect of on the ground, until you're actually shooting at a a longer range of 500, 800 yards away, which, it's in the capability of a light roll Bren. Certainly 500 would be.
Hmm.
And when you're looking in places like perhaps the desert or something like that, where those ranges do exist, and even in places in Europe, of course, um, um, the Far East, very select,
Hill to hill. I mean, you do have that.
there's one aspect to that. But it's that you're not trying to put all the bullets on one man. You're actually using the fire to, cover the front of a friendly position so that when they get attacked, that fire was coming from enfilade into that target from the side, and those bullets will travel across, within the height of a man, just like the theory says, and then to move through that is going to be exceptionally difficult without being hit, as opposed to being aimed at individually and picked off, as it were, by either a single shot or a burst. And I think that aspect to it is something that, again, perhaps a more modern or a pop culture reference, is not quite understood as easily as there's a target, you shoot a whole bunch of rounds at it, and to say that it's too accurate is that, well, I want it to spread the rounds out more, so it creates more of a beaten zone. But the beaten zone isn't at a target. Beaten zone is across a target, right?
Yeah,
So
beaten zone is always a difficult one to explain, and we're trying to explore some interesting ways to explain that at the moment. And I won't allude to what we're doing any more than that, but we are trying to work out how we can provide some graphical or realistic interpretation of the beaten zone without hurting anybody. So without actually having to shoot a beaten zone, with the Vickers at 2 miles away, we're trying to work out how we can do that in a very confined space with some firearms, but like in a sub caliber context. And so the too accurate piece just doesn't
I think
ring
I think
true.
you summed it up perfectly by saying, if you want something that's less accurate, then just wave it around.
Yeah,
Like, really,
yeah, yeah.
it's something that obviously I've heard of, and quite frankly never understood as to why that would be a thing, why that would be an aspect that would be honed in on as being detrimental
Yeah.
to this arm. And obviously the first thing I I think there was a comment or something along those lines that was indicating that weapons were physically altered, whether it was
Oh, you can't
barrels,
afford the muzzle.
something like that, to
Yeah,
make them inherently less accurate,
yeah,
which just to me is, it's just ridiculous. It's
yeah,
silly that
yeah.
that no armor would do that. Nobody would take it to somebody and say, "Hey, can you take a file to this to make it less accurate?"
And I think as well, if you start to look at some of the accuracy trials for the Mark III to the Mark II, and this Mark III developments happened quite early.
Mhm.
So even with that shorter barrel that's on the Mark III, they didn't see any detrimental effect of accuracy at combat ranges. So yeah, it's like, oh yeah, we can put a shorter barrel on it. It doesn't do anything to the accuracy. Oh, why didn't we put that on in the first place? I don't know. Don't tell anybody. Yeah, it's like,
We're all set up to make these ones.
yeah,
Shh.
yeah. But then we'd only need shorter lathes, and we'd save all that metal as well.
Just
Yeah, stay quiet. Yeah. So it doesn't. I mean, the Bren's accuracy isn't just about that. Isn't just about it. It's set up for it. It's a heavyweight. It's a heavy light machine gun. There's a lot of metal in it, I suppose, there to absorb the recoil of a 303 round. And I think as well, one of the interesting things that I've found, and this is another sort of misconception, is that it pulls you along the ground as well, and it doesn't. But if you there's a weird feeling when you fire it on repetition, and that's because the buffer is pushing the working parts. The working parts are doing something weird inside, but not immediately coming back. So actually, all the physics are taking you forward again. So it does feel like there's that forward force once you fired it, but it's not pulling you forward. It's it's not going to drag you along the ground. Um, how did they advance up that hill while they were all firing Bren guns and they all just moved, they just floated across the grass. Yeah, so there's a few things about the Bren, and yeah, you'll have definitely had some of those comments, I'm sure, in some of the videos that you've been producing as well. If you haven't, you're on a different YouTube to what we are. Um, so yeah, there's plenty of myth around all these firearms, and some of them are great to unpick as to where they came from.
Yeah, it's hard to determine that sometimes, but in terms of my personal experience, there was never a moment where, well, either of those, either it being too accurate or it crawling forward on the ground ever was something that I experienced. Any inaccuracy was always due to me.
Which won't be much.
Which-
So again, I reiterate the point that you picked up a Bren gun for the first time, and I can't remember if it was on Mark 1 or Mark 2. It doesn't really matter, does it? But you got like a 2x2 group at about 100 yards. I went, oh yeah, okay. And then I think one of the telling pieces is on the tripod. It doesn't matter how good a shot you are. So you can take over that tripod mounted Bren from me, from anybody, and you're going to get a 4 inch by 4 inch group. It's as simple as that, because it's the tripod. And that's one of the great things about the Vickers, about all these tripod mounted firearms, is that there's a consistency of shot between firers. And yeah, so yeah, where I think some of the too accurate piece comes from. Wait a minute, I've taken it out of the rest and it shoots better than it is in the rested position in the tripod, so it must be too accurate. Who knows? There's certainly crazy thoughts.
is Before, I have got a couple more questions for you, but I'm thinking we're on the subject of the tripod right now, and it's something that obviously you afforded me the opportunity to shoot from
Mm-hmm.
in a awareness kind
Yeah,
of scheme. And subsequent to that, I've done a lot of work on the actual drills and whatnot through the work on the channel and presenting the use of the tripod. And the latest video has been actually on the fixed line site, which obviously
yeah.
needs to be used in conjunction with the tripod. Is there anything specifically, and one of the questions that I came up with that I necessarily couldn't really find an answer, I've had to sort of make my form an opinion about it, is that in terms of its use. And in terms of at the beginning, the documentation certainly points to every gun will have a tripod
Mm-hmm.
for the various circumstances that the army, but in particular the platoon or the section, would find itself in as being part of a bigger system. The attack versus the defense, that kind of thing. Later, as if I recall correctly, the sort of ratio of tripods drops to about one per platoon,
Mm-hmm.
each carried in the truck. And it's actually very difficult, I've found anyway, to find examples of, how do I put it? I guess I can categorize them into three as I've discovered them. One is in training, where it's very obviously in training or as part of a propaganda film or something like that,
Yeah,
where like, then second is actually part of fortification. So you're not so much, yes, you are training on them. You're not actually in action in those. And I found just fairly recently quite a few pictures of Brens on tripods in coastal defenses in the UK, the concrete bunkers and this kind of thing that
yeah,
were
yeah. The
built
pillboxes.
in the pillboxes in the early part of the war, which is a source of photographs that I hadn't tapped into and hadn't discovered until quite recently. And then, of course, there's the third category is the use of the tripod, either actually being fired in action or simply being used on a position that's obviously in a theater,
Yeah,
not just guarding a base, but actually in the bush, ostensibly guarding a position that the enemy is going to be approaching. So those three categories are sort of what I've broken down my discoveries into. And it's easier to find pictures of the tripod in use in training,
mm-hmm.
which might be understandable. But then it it appears to me that the tripod going into the war is something that's seen as very important and integral to the role of the Bren. in its own little slice of the battle. But it would seem to me as though that capability is something that is uh, it's proven to be not as important. It still has some sort of niche somewhere, but the way it was looked at going into the war has been proven through operations during the war just to be not something that is required. We have other weapons that can fill this role,
Yeah.
and the Bren does its job and what we want it to do without all this other stuff that we have to mount it to. It can, in the light roll, it can cover its 500 yard, range, effective range, which reaches out in front of the neighboring section or the neighboring platoon. It does that without having to go through the procedures and the use of the tripod, which obviously then ties you to a specific spot. I'm wondering if you have anything to comment on that.
Yeah, the thing that springs to mind. So there's two aspects in the doctrine, and the doctrine is I'll give you a quick intro and try not to forget where I was. So basically, I'm writing a book at the moment that is a capability primer. So you might have seen them. If not, I'll get some over to you. Basically, I've written one on the Vickers, 1944 to 45. So this is using that defence lines of development study piece as a structure to analyse the Vickers, and I've done the Lewis, and the next one's the Bren. But the context is 39 to 41, because in 41 everything changes ish, and the main change around that is the organisation of the infantry division. And what? So if you bear in mind that the Bren is the only automatic firepower in an infantry battalion, well, in an infantry division until November 1941, because the Vickers doesn't exist as a divisional asset. It's a core asset attached to divisions.
I didn't know
So,
that.
so in the BEF, you've got core assets that are the machine gun battalions and army assets. Those are attached to divisions, and they end up attached to divisions they end up attached to for the whole part of from November.
Right.
So things like 15th Scottish in 51st Highland, they were there to start with, but they were technically a core asset. So arguably, when you look at the war establishments, the Bren is the only automatic firepower. So if that's the only automatic firepower that a divisional commander has to play with, he needs it to do everything that you need automatic firepower to do, in which case you need it to cover movement and defense. So you need it to cover the attack, the advance, the withdrawal, and the defense, static defense as well. So if you do that, you need a tripod, because we don't need it, but it's better if you have the tripod that can set up fixed lines and fixed defensive locality, forward defensive localities and fixed line fire and all of those things from within the battalions. You don't have to call on any external support. So the movement aspects are clearly just the light roll. You don't ever need the tripod for that. But that tripod in the defensive role is the only automatic firepower you've got as a division, and you can combine that with your mortars. You can combine it with your 25 pounders and everything that you've got within the division, but your Vickers, your medium machine guns sit outside of that at that point. Arguably, that's only on paper, because the first thing that corps and armies do is pass down the machine gun battalions. But that 1936 to 1938 reorganization of the army into three types of battalion: the rifle battalion, the infantry rifle battalion, the infantry machine gun battalion, and then the infantry mixed battalion, those really separate, not only from an organizational equipment logistics perspective, but they really separate out the doctrine as well. So November 1941 is when the war establishments change all that, the orders of battle. They put the machine gun battalions attached into the divisions. So this is one of the reasons why we can hark everything back to the Vickers. That's the lens. That's the lens at which we look through stuff. So that's our answer. What was the question? Answers Vickers MG. No, it's one of those where that was what came to mind. Obviously I'm biased because that's the reading that I'm doing, but that's what came to mind when you were talking about that. But that doctrine of movement and defense, movement and defense is what's in the section handling pamphlet for 1939. The tripod does go down from 42 in those rewrites to one per platoon, and that isn't necessarily to provide that fixed line fire. That's actually local anti-aircraft stuff as well, isn't it? So it's not until the Mark II tripod comes in that goes, well, we're not really, we don't need it for anti-aircraft because we've got 20 mil really big things that can do that. And then we,
and,
oh, well,
and the RAF.
yeah, and the RAF, yeah. By the time the RAF come along, we got light anti-aircraft 40 mil Bofors. Well, put that Bren on that tripod and do your best. Yeah, it's one of those where you you look at these different things happening that lead to tripods being slung in the back of the truck, but they're still there. The Mark II Star tripod, this little half scale thing is sent with the airborne forces because they still see a role for fixed line firing. And we've got some of the G1098, so the equipment catalog lists, and it's we've got copies of them actually rather than the originals. I don't think we've got the originals, but they show what comes in with the tripod and how's it to be used and what kit was supposed to be issued with it. And an interesting, just sort of point of fact is that in the 39 pamphlet, it talks about the spare barrel only being carried when you're carrying the tripod. Because in movement, you don't need a spare barrel. What you're on about? You're not going to be firing that much that often. So the two go along together, and then clearly they realise actually the guys are doing quite a bit of firing. Give them a spare barrel as well. So the tripod goes back to that anti-aircraft role, but isn't really needed because, like you say, the RAF, other anti-aircraft assets are all in play. So you're going to see less of it. And I think it's one of the reasons why you see quite limited use of the drum magazines as well, is because they're not needed. All they do is add weight, make them live in a truck with the tripod. You don't see these things come along, and they didn't exist before 42 and in these early years of the war anyway. So you don't see the stuff being used together. So it just becomes added weight, but it's still valuable, and it's still there in the L4 stuff in the 50s and 60s as well. There's still Brens on tripods being developed because there's still potentially a role for fixed position firing, even when you've got GPMG, because some of your battalions might not have GPMG, or you're not putting GPMG into that conflict, like Northern Ireland, and different battalions not having it. So we're going to keep tripods in place for some of these things so that you can set up your fixed lines at night, create your defensive locality with Brens on tripods, and go off and have a cup of tea because the tripod's there set up for you to go and fire it when you need to.
Right. As you were talking there, I'm just remembering some of the pictures that I found, and they illustrated a couple of different aspects of it. One, I believe, was taken in Italy, it might have been, but it's a tripod that's set up inside a house with a gun pointed out the window, and it's very clearly being used as like a flexible pintle mount. That the traversing and elevating mechanism isn't attached to the butt. He's just got the front pin on, and he's using it as a pivot point so it can get him elevated through the window. Which was interesting to me. And
there's also another reason for that, because when
mounting the gun in the room rather than pointing out the window.
Okay,
have something to say with that, but you go on.
Yeah, so we've had to do that quite a few times when the what was it? The cocking handle extension twists quite a bit. And if it twists and it's all clamped in to the rear point, it won't fire, it stops. So the buffer won't work. So if you ever look at some of the footage of some of us firing, it looks like we're being really, firing from a room in Italy, but we're not. It just won't work if we clamp it down. So it's always, that's sort of one of our experiences where the Bren hasn't worked so well sometimes.
The second one that I recall was, I was just looking at an old newsreel, and it was about, I think it was about Imphal Kohima, that part of the late war in the Far East. And it was the use and actually firing on the tripod fixed with both pins in. And that really, given the general understanding of the topography from sort of hilltop to hilltop, just like you mentioned, was that, they're not engaging the enemy at 100 yards at that point. They're shooting across a valley or, down a long slope or into a gully or something that's it's good. It's going to be at an extended range. What is it, 500 or something like that? And given the context of what you're looking at as far as they're on a hilltop and the gun isn't pointed down, it's pointed across. So you know they're shooting out.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But covering the front of another hill where the Japanese are advancing up, and you're be able to shoot at them from the side as they attack the other position. And now you've got this gun in a way that you can finally control, its attitude towards the target, and it's held very securely so that those rounds are going to go where you want them, and you can adjust them as you see fit. Um, and also, there's something to be said for the fact of the tripod providing the opportunity to, I want to say sustain fire, but certainly a more rapid and
yeah,
sustained, small s sustained,
yeah,
because you don't have to hold it. You have to just
yeah,
pull the trigger, and the number two, who would be there when you are using the tripod, is there for that timely magazine change, as the drills and the doctrine would allude to in the first place. But in the light roll, perhaps you're not. It's not quite as the two of you may not be like this together, although there's plenty of photographs of that showing. Um, but on the tripod, it's a one position, and if there was a number two with a magazine waiting, as soon as that gun stops firing and that magazine comes off, the next one's on. It's cocked
yeah.
or it's cocked and then taken. The interruption due to the changing of magazines with two men is is actually not that great
No,
when
we've
when
done
you look
that.
at the pause that you need to
Yeah,
take in the light roll, particularly
yeah,
in re-aiming and firing the next burst. It's not
yeah,
that much different. By yourself, obviously pulling magazine out of a pouch that you've just arrived at a position and have to change your magazine. That's going to be a bit longer, but certainly in those circumstances, on the tripod with a number two and your supply of ammunition close at hand, is that it's not perhaps what one would think as far as the delay that is caused by the changing of magazines. That was something interesting to me
yeah.
anyway.
And I think you're right, because that is in the manual. I think one of the remarkable things is we think, oh wow, that looks, but that's in the manual. Yeah, the number two doesn't have to be there with the number one in the movement phase, but in the defensive phase, it's there. And actually, one of the things I wrote about just the other day, in the last 48 hours, was the number three's role. Because this, bear in mind, we're talking about 1939 to 41 at the moment, 42, where you've got the section commander, a number one, a number two, a number three, four, five, six, seven. You don't have the second in command in charge of the gun group. That's a later thing.
That's an
Um,
interesting point that I found out because of another document you
yeah.
put up, which was the 1938 section leading book.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a
Yeah,
good one.
because it when you
Yeah.
dig into that, you realize that that subdivision of the section wasn't really a thing until mid-war. The
It's 42.
Yeah,
It's the small arms training changes in 42 that comes from some of the battle school stuff that's post 40, post North Africa and things. But yeah, it's 42 when that gun group starts to exist. And so the section commander, is there directing, obviously. The number one has the Bren, the number two in the movement role is gathering the magazines that are required. So carries utility pouches, but they're empty, and uses one to put mags in as they get it, and then uses the other one, and then leaves that with the number one. So we can go off to the rest of the section and start to grab others. And the number three has a spare set of utility pouches. So it's very different to how we view it for 44, 45. But then in the defense, the number two stays with the number one and is doing that rapid magazine change. And the number three is going off doing that number two role. So it's very different about how, and in the movement, the four, five, six, and seven are very much seen as just ammunition bearers and riflemen. In the defense, they're riflemen and observers. So because they're not carrying ammunition far, but obviously they've got the magazines in their pouches.
it's
So
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
that's just a fascinating sort of, the organization of the section changes depending on what you're doing. Sounds so logical, but is not what students of later war, the bits when we were winning, the students of those areas don't necessarily understand, and how it
Yeah.
changed in that 42 period.
You can trace though it to look at a chunk of time before that and after, and you can see where it evolves to. But you can also see where it evolved from, which is sort of the pre-war four-section 2-and-2 Orbat of the
Yeah.
platoon with,
Yes.
sections being rifle or Lewis, either or.
Yeah.
But in terms of how we support this light machine gun in action, the Lewis section was a group of men that are 100% focused on one weapon
Yeah.
and keeping that weapon in action and protecting it locally, just like it was in the Great War. And that organization goes through up until the late 30s when they basically bring the Bren in, and the platoon goes from 2 guns to 3 guns, which incidentally was really interesting. Is that even in the 38 section leading, it's the Bren gun use within the section is almost optional.
Yeah.
It's allowing for the flexibility. Say maybe we just need you as riflemen, and you won't have the Bren.
Yeah.
You can see that that's perhaps something that has come about from the earlier paradigm as
Yeah.
maintaining
That
that kind of
transition.
degree of this might be what happens, but then when reality hits, it's like, no, we're not going anywhere without our Bren gun. But
And I think that sort of thing, that rifle, that sort of 2-and-2 is hugely missed, in how we perceive light machine gun automatic use. It is hugely missed. And it is like when we go to infantry rifle battalions, every section's an LMG section. If you were going to take it from that 20s and that early 30s
yes,
context,
that's it.
every section's an LMG section. We've actually got rid of the rifle sections. They're irrelevant. Everybody's there. And I think that is a perception that's had with the German army. They were all the riflemen were there with their 5-round K98s was to support the machine gun, and that's a point of difference. It's not a point of difference. It's the same. Yeah, and it does become a point of difference, but it isn't. It isn't to start with. We have the same LMG concept.
Yeah. The fact that the section wasn't really subdivided until that mid-war point,
Yeah,
doctrinally anyway,
yeah,
um, it is something that without delving into the manual, which explains the doctrine of it, and then understanding that, that central focal point of the section being the Bren, it all sort of flushes the picture out.
yeah,
And not until later, when the sort of experience of the early part of the war, comes home to roost, that they realize, well, wait a minute, there is either being used already or it's something we need to develop, is this ability to subdivide and use the Bren, not supported by a whole section of people, but just three. And that's enough for the immediate tactical task at hand. And the remainder of the section are then free to maneuver or conduct some other part of the operation. Is, obviously it's a step, and perhaps because of that organization's use post-war for a long period of time, right up until like the 80s, basically, or even the 90s, is that we can see where that came from. But looking at the way that the Bren was used, before that, we can get a much more rich picture
yeah.
in
We can. I mean,
looking at where it's come from that Great War experience, from the
yeah,
interwar experience, and the way machine guns, and light machine guns in particular, were handled within the context of the infantry. And it comes out the other end of World War II in particular as being something that is, proven and worthy of perpetuation for many, many, well, decades after, right?
yeah. I think just as a quick sort of anecdote. So 2002 is when the L4 like ends. So it's really late on, and I used to do some work with the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. We used to take some firearms there from the Small Arms School Corps weapons collection at Warminster and give them historic firearms stuff as part of their battlefield studies. And I did this during the pandemic, so this isn't that long ago. And the commandant at the time was an ex-Royal Corps of Transport and then Royal Logistics Corps guy that would walk up, look at the Brens and go, I had a Bren on my truck. And you could see the students of 2021, 22 going, or the officer cadets go, how old is he? Yeah, and you could see them trying to work it out. It's like, no, I had an LMG. It was the weapon that was on the truck as local anti-aircraft if we needed it. And he said, I loved it. It was great. And he's talking about the late 90s, or and late 80s, well into the 90s. And I think that just gives this was a generation that you were just completely alien to that concept that it had been introduced so long ago, and therefore it must be short-lived. And that's something that I do see with the Vickers. The guys in 1938, 39 saying, well, we've dropped in all these new machine guns. That one's been in service for a while, so it must be old, so we must get rid of it. And I think that's a concept that is still held today. Well, it's been in service for a long time, so we must get rid of it. And clearly the Bren survived that passage of time to some extent. The Vickers did as well. So yeah, it's the tripod lasted as not quite as long, I don't think. I think the last stuff is the early 70s when the tripod appears. But yeah, it certainly outlived our normal thought processes.
For sure,
that should have done. Yeah.
Is this perhaps a good moment we've talked about misconceptions, and that dovetailed into a further discussion that we've just sort of rounded up here, is we touched on it briefly, either before or just at the very beginning, was um, the mechanics. And a lot of viewers will be surprised to hear that you living in England have access to all these, whether it be Vickers or Brens or other arms of the era, and how you, one, I guess, are able to own them, and two, more importantly, shoot them in their full capabilities. Is that something that you'd perhaps enlighten the viewers about?
Yeah, so it's rare, and we're not a museum. We don't hold a museum firearms license, or these things exist. We are an independent company in the first instance, and a charity, and we hold a prohibited weapons authority, so commonly called Section 5. Because Section 5 of the Firearms Act in 1968 is the thing that prohibited all these all the stuff, and that's been amended a few times. So the only stuff in common ownership over here under Section 1 and Section 2 are bolt action rifles, semi-automatics, 2 rimfire stuff, and shotguns. And there's then some pistols and stuff that are held on historic licenses, but if you want to shoot those, they have to be held at a range. So firearms ownership is not common in the United Kingdom, or in England and Wales, which in the legislation that covers us. And we're one of, now the numbers that were given to me a fair few years have probably gone down because they since started charging for these. So we're a registered firearms dealer in the first instance, and then we have to apply to the Home Office for this Section 5 authority. And we have to present a business case. So what are we going to do with these things? So we have to have good reason, as you do for all firearms in the UK. Our reason has to be business, or I'm going to say commercial, but commercial means that we're making profit. We're not. We just have to have good reason from running a business, or in our case, a charity. As part of that, we've got a good place to keep them, so a secure facility, and good people. So everybody that comes in and accesses these and fires them with us does so having been checked beforehand. And our good reason is education. So say our charitable remit is education to the general public of military history and firearms. And we have to demonstrate that every 3 years that we're doing what we said we would do, and we are doing it in a we won't say an entertaining way. We always stop at edutainment, as I think like advertorials are. We do have to have that educational basis for doing, and hopefully we hit that. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it wasn't meant to be, but hopefully we do that, and we do the research and everything alongside it. And I think although we have the machine guns, the pistols, the semi-automatics, and even the mortars and rocket launchers that we do with what we do, we are publishing, we are presenting the material online, we are sharing that, and we are giving people an opportunity in a safe and suitable environment to come and see it as well. And it is if somebody was to ask, I formed the not-for-profit company out of my own collection of deactivated stuff back in 2011. We finally received, after a couple of times of asking quietly, authority to possess prohibited weapons in 2017, and we became a charity in 2024. So it's not an all at once process. It's a justification of what we're doing and how that's grown. And we have to have people that are interested in what we do, and thankfully we do through some events that we go and support. The Royal Armouries have been kind enough to contract us to provide their firing demonstrations for them as well, and different events do the same. We then self-generate our own events through demonstration days, schools events, and even some stuff back into the Ministry of Defence and the British Army in what we do as well. So it's not easy, and I would certainly not recommend anybody try and do it. Not because I want to safeguard our place in the market, but it's hard work and it's quite horrible sometimes. We are focused on our education piece in the archive, and what the machine guns and the firing provide is that modern day understanding. So is that ability to compare and contrast what we're reading, what we're learning, the secondary sources, some of those primary sources, with our experiences, with the collection that we maintain as well. And then, one of the events that we did last year, and we'll be doing again soon, is the We Have Ways Festival. And it was a good example where we put Bren's and an MG42. It was an M53 actually, so it was a slower rate of fire. It's the post-war Yugoslav example of the 42 that does about 900 rounds a minute. We put those on the ground in front of an audience next to each other, and we fired them. And you could hear people say, "Oh, we get it. We get why people say that that's got the morale effect that it does. We get that." And you don't get that through TV. You don't get that through YouTube and stuff in the same way that you do out there. And what we add to that, rather than, we don't do the reenactment side of things, and there's some elements that we would like to be able to do more with living historians and some of the stuff in kit, because people want to see that. But we don't do that, so people can really focus on the firearms, and focus on the technology and what we're telling them about that. So when we're firing them, they're not seeing people run about and fire them. They're seeing them just static firing at the rates of fire, at the types that we're doing, and we can slow that down and talk to people about it as we're doing it. And we many of those events are blank firing, but we have started to introduce these demonstration days where we are able to have school groups, history students, great, even history teachers. There's not many history teachers that have come from university now that have gone, "Oh yeah, I've seen a machine gun fire." It's or I've been as close as we've had history teachers in the room here with us when we were firing blank, and they've been feeding Vickers belts as number twos. So they feel it. That's why you don't get it through the screen. They feel the concussive effect in their chest of automatic fire. And when you're then talking about shell shock, and you're teaching students about the different effects and how they make you feel, they can say some of that. And they can talk about some of that with a little bit more authority than they would otherwise be able to. So we recently had say A-level students with their teachers, where the students actually got the opportunity to fire rimfire rifles. Then if they wanted to, 303 or 792 Mauser or Lee Enfield. We worked with a couple of clubs over here to do that, and then they got to see the Vickers, the Lewis, and the Vickers and the Lewis fire. I can't remember what other. We did have another couple of MGs with us, and then there was stuff that was completely wasted on A-level students, and that was the EM2, but because we were test firing it, and there was, and I think an MP44. It was one of those where they didn't know what they were seeing at that point. We were just getting on with things, but if they'd have known, they'd have been really interested. But by doing that, we do hit those educational pieces. We're the only, we are one of the, I'm going to say the only organization that does what we do, not necessarily just from a machine gun perspective, but then has the archive material that backs that up. So that is absolutely key. We know we could lose the privilege of having the Section 5 authority. A tiny mistake, or just the appetite of the association to run it. Because like I say, it is hard work. And the finances, feeding machine guns is not easy. Hence, we try and make some of that self-sustaining with the contracts, but the Patreon support and everything that really does support that, we don't get the opportunity to monetize our videos on YouTube because we mostly do machine guns. So the framework in which we exist isn't set up to support us. So we know we could lose that. So we base that in the archive and in the education and in the books and the publishing to make sure that stuff works as well. So yeah, it's a rare one. I think at the moment there are probably less than 10. I'm going to say the half a dozen or less people, organizations like us in the UK that can conduct demonstrations in the same way. And we are likely, I'm never going to say that, no, but we're likely the only charity that's doing that. And I would include the likes of the Royal Armouries. They do what they do and they provide the output that they do, and they have the national and the statutory requirements to do it. But they do that as part of a bigger thing. And I say we're the only people when they've done full automatic firing displays for the public, that's actually been us. So it's a difficult balance for many things, and it requires us to spin a lot of plates a lot of the time and hope that none of them fall.
Well, as somebody who has benefited from your educational pursuits in terms of putting material out there and holding events, and well, in our case in 2022, shooting is I have been the recipient of many of those aspects, and I'm most grateful. And anyone who is, either in the UK or interested, the links to reaching out to you will be provided in this video as part. Obviously, they're on the website of the collection. So it's invaluable service, really, that you're providing to the community, and not just the gun community, but the military history community, the educational, the academic community in terms of your pursuit. So I personally am indebted to you and your work in making what I do possible, because
I appreciate that.
in those senses that
Great, thank you.
without access to some of that, first source, primary source manuals and that kind of thing, it would have been dead in the water, or I would never have even known about it to even have the idea to make a video about it. So it's something that's I hold close to my heart, and it's something that I'm very appreciative of. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I mean, it is that kind of thing that although we operate in the UK, I think our reach is far beyond that. It's an interesting one because people don't expect people in the UK to know about machine guns, despite the majority of them coming from here in the first place. And it's certainly what we do is try and talk about much wider aspects to then hone down into. So we're aware we cross over so many different customer bases, interested groups, really. And the firearms community is one of those where historical and current users were able to provide access to more resources for as well.
So given the fact that you've been working so diligently in building the collection and your work and your research and whatnot, is there, in the Bren specifically, is there anything that you would have on the shelf, waiting, that you haven't achieved with it, or haven't, put it through its paces in a certain way? Is there anything that you're looking to do with the Bren that you haven't done yet?
Yeah, we want to mount a barrel. No, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, I think you said yourself with the indirect fire, the fixed line sight video. You're the first you're the first person to put that on YouTube, and I think that's great. And there's a huge element of admiration for that, and I think we'd love to be able to explain some of that as well, how that fixed line sight works with the firing, and hopefully we've got some access to different facilities to be able to do that. One of the things that we did a few years ago now, we actually did it during the pandemic. It was a reason / excuse to get people back together, was do the living historian training on the rangefinder.
I remember
And
that.
yeah, and it worked really well because we basically took people that didn't know how to use a rangefinder and made them range takers. And despite some of them thinking they were just going to come and sit in a shed and be filmed and just nod at appropriate points, they had to do some stuff and they had to learn it and they had to do it.
Pay
And I think
attention to this. There'll be a test.
yeah, exactly. And some of them really quite valued that experience. A couple of them you see in the start of the videos and not in the end. Um, but I think we'd love to do something like that with the Bren as well, because there's you've covered it brilliantly in the videos that you've got, but you'd read it first, and I'd love to be able to take that recruit perspective where we take somebody and genuinely teach them the Bren. And I think that would be fascinating. The second thing is that I want to put together the modern training package around the Bren. We've done that for the Vickers. We had to do that. We have to do some of that with, so basically, one of the things about being the company and doing what we do, we are affected by all the health and safety laws and regulations. So we have to train people to use the inspected and checked equipment, and we have to maintain training records. And the Bren is a package that I'd like to do around that modern side of things, because again, there's stuff to learn on the Bren that they didn't worry about then. When they put, you can't just take the 39 or 42 manual and teach somebody it and go, oh, well, they're safe to use the Bren on a modern range. They won't be. The other, and then sort of the third piece is an extension of both, really. Is at the moment we have a substantial number of very early Mark 1s here. And I want to get all of those on a range. And we did the 16 Vickers MGs at Bisley back early 2022.
Yeah, fantastic event. That was
yeah.
unbelievable.
We
Unbelievable.
learned so much from that, and we will still go back to any event in the UK now, and actually, I'd say globally to some extent, any firearms event, and people will talk to us about that. And some of the comments are great because did you see? It's like, yeah, I did. Yeah, it was really good, wasn't it? Where were you stood? I was at the front. What? I said, there's a bloke on a microphone making some waffle. That was me. And lots of people talk to us about that because they think that was organised by either the National Rifle Association of the UK or the MOD because it was so big. And arguably the MOD was the last organisation to do something similar, less guns, less ammunition, but back in 2002. So we did that with 16 because it was a company. I'd like to do probably a battalion's worth of Brens at some point. Let's say we've got a reasonable number. But the challenge is actually getting the people not interested, but the commitment to get the people to come and do a few days, find the appropriate ranges. And we just shared a photo a few days ago, depending on when this goes out, but it was the 3rd of September 1937, 2 years earlier than the anniversary people really talk about, was the first Bren off the production line. So that might be our target for 2027, maybe 90 years since the introduction of the Bren, or that first one off the production line, maybe our target for that. So there's big impactful events, and the impactful events are very expensive, both in actual physical cost, time, and resources to put into them, and goodwill, but they're often worth it.
Ammunition.
Yes. Yeah, ammunition is a challenge. I think it'd be less of a challenge for a battalion's worth of Brens than it was for the 16 Vickers. So we shall see.
That sounds like a fantastic, especially a goal a number of years in the future.
You've always got to have goals.
You've got a perfect anniversary to mark. That's something to look forward to for sure. That's fantastic. I guess I'd like to round out the conversation with one more question, if you don't mind, and that is, I would say that anybody with even the passing interest in military history of Britain and the Commonwealth knows about the Bren and what the Bren is, and it's the light machine gun. But I was wondering if in your entire time sort of learning about it as it's come to be, a greater part, not a greater, more part, but just become part of and built within the collection proper, has there been anything that you have discovered that was surprising, or was there anything there that stands out as you look back as saying, you know what, I wasn't expecting to know that, but having, read that, I discovered this about the Bren. Is there anything like that that you might be able to comment on?
Yeah, and I think I've alluded to it, and I sort of said it explicitly. Everything changes in 1942, and I think that genuinely, if you took that perspective, that is, we've learnt about the Bren, and by doing that, we've looked at the organisation of an infantry division and an army and a corps. So through that learning of the Bren, it gives you a different perspective of how the army operates. And I think everything changes in 42. People can talk about from so many different perspectives: air war, success, victory, defeat. It's all of that stuff. But it happens with the Bren as well. And I think people studying 44, 45, Northwest Europe won't understand 1940 use of the Bren. They won't understand, North Africa use of the Bren particularly, that's the sort of my takeaway from a lot of the research, that you have to learn stuff twice. You have to learn pre 42 and post 42
Right.
to get that big picture, and by doing so, you can learn so much more about the wider subject. It always surprises me as well that if you want to look up the section structure of the British Army, you have to look in the Bren manual. It sort of shows you the importance with which it's used to lead everything. And as I said at the very start, the ubiquitous nature of the Bren means that everybody has an opinion. Everybody had an experience. It was recruit training. Everybody had heard about the Vickers and knew about the Vickers, but they didn't have an experience. But the Bren they did, and I think those few things combined make it a fascinating firearm that complements the work we do here brilliantly.
Yeah. That's a great way to sort of end the discussion. And it's always interesting to hear somebody so like such as yourself, so well experienced in the academic nature, but also the practical nature of all of these things, to have still something that really surprised them in terms of their journey learning. And thank you for sharing that, Rich. I think we've been talking now for close to 2 hours, and I think we've covered a lot of great subjects that I have been completely engrossed in listening to you talk about, because you've got such an interesting, approach, but also and the information that you've collected, both academically, but also in having the collection and using these things practically, is something that is of great benefit. And you can obviously speak with authority, and it comes across in the way you've delivered the information today. And I really appreciate that, and coming on to talk about it with us today.
Thank you, Rob. Very much appreciated too. I like talking about it. It's fine.
It's whenever people, myself included, start talking about things that interest them, that we go skirt around the black hole a bit, and time stands still at times. So the fact that we've kept it to about 2 hours or so is something that, although it's completely, we could easily go on for another two, I'm sure. Whether the viewers or not would
Save that for another day.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, we'll do that another time. Just pick
Anyway.
a random subject and let's go.
Great. Rich, I hope we're able to do this again, perhaps on a different topic, or even to expand on this one. But again, thank you very much for coming on. And for those of you that are unaware of the Vickers Collection and Research Association, that the links to that and the webpage will be, and the YouTube channel for that matter, will be posted in the description below. So Rich, again, thanks very much, and we'll talk to you later.
Cheers, Rob.
If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.